My name is Margaret Hensley. I am 65 years old, a widow who spent most of her life as a school librarian in a small town where order and words mattered more than money. I thought I had raised my only son to understand respect and gratitude, but on the night he won the lottery, he proved me wrong in the cruelest way. The rain was hammering down so hard that the gutters overflowed, flooding the walkway. My suitcase split open on the front steps, spilling clothes into the mud. Ethan stood in the doorway, his face twisted with contempt, shouting, "Freeloader! Don't expect a penny from me!" He had the look of a man intoxicated by sudden wealth, but also blinded by arrogance. Clara, my daughter-in-law, stood behind him, her arms folded tightly, her face unreadable. And Victor, his so-called friend, leaned against the doorframe with a smirk that cut deeper than the storm. That was the night my son kicked me out of my own home, the very day he claimed a $22 million lottery prize. He didn't even notice that the ticket he waved around so proudly wasn't in his name. I said nothing. Silence, I realized, was more powerful than his rage. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love or forced to face humiliation when all you gave was kindness, then you'll understand why I'm sharing this story. Stay with me, because what followed wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about the truth no storm can wash away. But before I take you further, let me invite you to settle in. If stories like this speak to your heart, if you believe in quiet strength and finding justice even when the world thinks you've lost, then this space is for you. You're welcome here, and I hope you'll stay until the end. The rain stung my cheeks as I bent down to gather my scattered clothes. Each blouse and skirt was soaked, plastered with dirt from the yard. My hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the realization that my own child could turn so merciless overnight. I remembered the mornings when I used to pack his lunch, write his name in neat block letters, and whisper encouragement at the school gates. Now he hurled that very name back at me like an insult. Clara stepped forward for a moment, and for a second I thought she might help. Instead, she closed the door slowly, the chain rattling into place. My body shook from the weight of rejection heavier than the storm itself. I lifted the broken suitcase, the handle snapping in my grip, and walked down the driveway with rain dripping down my collar. Every step echoed with disbelief. How had I become a burden in the house I once held together? The yellow glow of the porch light dimmed behind me as Ethan slammed the door. In that moment, the warmth of family that had anchored me all my life flickered out. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying Victor's laughter after me, cruel and mocking. I stopped under the street lamp, clutching the soaked clothes to my chest, and whispered to myself, "So this is how it ends." Yet beneath the ache, another thought stirred, quiet, persistent, like the steady beat of my heart. He never even looked closely at the ticket. He never saw the signature I had placed with care. He thought he had shut me out forever. But sometimes silence carries more power than shouting, and sometimes patience has the sharpest edge of all. When I finally found a dry place to rest that night, my thoughts didn't linger on the rain or the sting of my son's words. They drifted back to gentler times when life seemed simpler and promises still carried weight. I remembered the first lottery ticket Ethan and I ever bought together. He was just a boy then, barely tall enough to see over the counter at Mr. Cole's gas station. I can still hear his excited voice tugging at my sleeve, begging me to let him scratch off the numbers. We lost, of course, but we laughed the whole way home, our hearts light with the silly dream of what if. That was the first time he told me, "Mom, if we ever win, we'll split it right down the middle." His eyes had shone with such honesty that I never questioned the promise. As the years passed, buying a ticket became our little ritual. Not every week, not enough to matter, but just often enough to keep the dream alive. Sometimes after work, on my way home from the library, I'd stop at the counter, and if Ethan was with me, we'd choose the numbers together. He'd pick his birthday, I'd pick mine, and we'd joke about what we would do if fortune ever smiled on us. His plans always leaned toward flashy cars and grand houses, but mine were humbler. I pictured a porch with a sturdy swing where I could sit and read in the evenings, perhaps with a cup of tea warming my hands. That swing became a symbol to me, a dream within reach if luck ever turned our way. There was one rainy afternoon I recall most vividly. Ethan must have been about 16. We ducked into Mr. Cole's station, dripping wet from walking back from town. I bought a ticket, and we huddled together near the candy rack as he scratched it with a coin from my purse. When the numbers didn't line up, I sighed, but he laughed, throwing an arm around my shoulder. "Don't worry, Mom. One day we'll hit it big. And when we do, you'll never have to work another day in your life." His voice carried a warmth that made me believe him. It wasn't about the money. It was about his promise, his assurance that he saw me, that he valued the years I had poured into raising him. Now, sitting alone with my damp clothes hanging over a chair to dry, I thought about how fragile that promise had become. I could still picture the little boy pressing his forehead against the glass counter, eyes wide with wonder. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who had forgotten kindness in the face of sudden wealth. It wasn't just the money that cut deep. It was the betrayal of our shared history, the memory of laughter turning to scorn. I remember one particular evening when he was already married to Clara, but still struggling to make ends meet. He had called me after work and asked if I wanted to stop by the station on our way home. Clara had teased him gently, saying, "You and your mom with those tickets." But he insisted we buy one, and when we did, he leaned close to me and whispered, "Remember our deal, Mom. Half and half, always." Clara smiled then, as though it was a harmless game, and I believed she found it endearing. I realize now that even then, perhaps, she thought differently. The lottery was never about riches to me. It was about hope, about sharing a small dream with the child I loved. It was about imagining a world where the sacrifices I made, staying late at the library for extra hours, cutting corners on groceries, skipping vacations, would someday be acknowledged with a simple gesture, a swing on a porch, a quiet afternoon free from worry. I didn't crave luxury. I only wanted peace. But the night he pushed me out, I understood that the swing I dreamed of was never in his plans. To him, the lottery had become a weapon, a chance to sever ties rather than strengthen them. My heart broke less for the money than for the memory of that long-ago promise scratched into the surface of a cheap ticket, now shattered like the handle of my suitcase. Still, as painful as it was to recall, those memories gave me strength. They reminded me that I was not crazy to expect better, that I had once known a version of my son capable of love and loyalty. And they reminded me that somewhere in the noise of rain and contempt, there was still a truth waiting to be uncovered. Because promises, once made, leave a trace, like ink pressed into paper or a signature written on the back of a ticket. They cannot simply vanish, no matter how loudly someone slams the door. That night, as I lay awake listening to the storm fade into silence, I whispered to myself that I would not forget. I would not let the cruelty of one night erase the years of devotion I had given. I had more strength than Ethan realized. I had memory, I had resolve, and above all, I had the truth of a promise my son had made, spoken in a voice full of innocence and conviction. Whether he remembered it or not, I carried it with me, and I knew one day it would matter. The morning after that storm, I woke with a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with the damp room where I had spent the night. It was the weight of knowing that something fundamental had shifted in my son. For days afterward, I tried to tell myself that Ethan had simply been overwhelmed by excitement, that the cruelty in his voice had been a passing moment. But deep down, I sensed the change had already taken root long before the lottery ticket entered our lives. The signs had been there, subtle but undeniable. I remembered the way Ethan's eyes had started to wander when we sat together at the dinner table. He used to listen when I spoke about books or the students I worked with, but lately his gaze drifted toward the clock or his phone. Clara would place her hand over his, offering a glance that looked tender, but carried something sharper underneath, as if reminding him to stay focused on their own goals. And then there was Victor, always appearing at just the right time, whispering ideas into Ethan's ear with a grin that never reached his eyes. In the weeks leading up to that fateful night, I had noticed Clara's conversations grow shorter, more clipped. She avoided meeting my gaze when we crossed paths in the kitchen, and if I asked about her work or Oliver's school, she offered only the barest replies. Yet sometimes, in quieter moments, I caught her watching me with a softness she quickly masked. It was as though she was torn between loyalty to her husband and a flicker of doubt about the path he was choosing. I did not press her. I simply observed, carrying the unease in my chest. The day the winning numbers were announced, the television in the living room blared with excitement. The news anchor's voice boomed, announcing that the $22 million ticket had been sold at Mr. Cole's gas station on Main Street. My heart skipped. That was the very place Ethan and I had bought tickets together so many times. I looked toward him, expecting to see surprise or joy, but instead I caught a flash of something harder. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted toward Clara, and they shared a look that excluded me entirely. Later that evening, I walked into the kitchen to find Clara standing by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. She turned as I entered, and though she offered a smile, her voice betrayed her unease. "Funny about the winning ticket, isn't it?" she said softly. "Mr. Cole must be thrilled to have sold it." Her words seemed harmless, but her eyes avoided mine, fixed instead on the steam curling from her cup. I felt the air shift between us, heavy with what went unspoken. Victor appeared more often in those days, too. He would swagger into the house as though he belonged there, his laughter loud, his presence filling every corner. He slapped Ethan on the back, speaking in tones too low for me to catch. But his eyes always flickered toward me with a glint of disdain. I knew the type. I had seen boys like him growing up, opportunists who thrived on planting ideas and fanning greed. My son, once so eager to please, seemed spellbound by his attention. What troubled me most was not the noise of their conversations, but the silence that followed whenever I entered the room. Ethan, who once shared every detail of his life with me, now offered only half smiles and vague remarks. He no longer sought my advice, no longer included me in his plans. Clara began setting the table with 3 plates instead of 4, as if forgetting I still lived there. Oliver, sweet boy that he was, seemed to sense the tension. He would glance at me with worried eyes, slipping his small hand into mine when no one was looking, as though trying to anchor me in the storm his parents refused to acknowledge. That evening, when the rain returned and the television once again reminded us of the winning ticket, I watched Ethan closely. His fingers tapped against the armrest, his knee bouncing with restless energy. He leaned toward Victor, who whispered something that made them both grin, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't joy I saw on my son's face. It was hunger, sharp and unrelenting. I tried to speak with him, gently reminding him of the ritual we once shared, the promises made in laughter and innocence. But he waved me off, saying, "Mom, that was kid stuff. Things are different now." The words stung, not because of what he said, but because of the finality in his tone. It was as if he had closed a door between us that I could no longer open. That night, I sat in my room and listened to the muffled voices drifting from the living room. Clara's tone was hushed, hesitant, while Victor's carried a confidence that rang like steel. Ethan's voice rose and fell, a mix of excitement and agitation. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling the steady thrum of my heart, and told myself that something was wrong. I couldn't yet name it, but I knew I was standing on the edge of a truth that would soon reveal itself. Looking back, I realized those days were the turning point. The news broadcast, the hushed conversations, the sidelong glances, all were warning signs I tried to ignore. I wanted to believe that love could hold us together, that the boy who once shared his dreams with me was still somewhere inside the man sitting in that living room. But as I closed my eyes that night, I felt the first cracks spreading through the foundation of trust we had built, cracks that no amount of silence could mend. It was 2 mornings after the news broadcast that I noticed something wrong in the kitchen. The refrigerator had always been my quiet bulletin board, covered with Oliver's drawings, recipes clipped from magazines, and little reminders I wrote to myself. In the center, held by a small red magnet shaped like a smiling sun, had been the lottery ticket. I had placed it there weeks earlier, not because I believed it would change my life, but because it was our ritual. I wanted to keep it safe, visible, a reminder of hope tucked between grocery lists and Oliver's crooked stars. That morning, the magnet was still there, grinning foolishly as always, but the ticket was gone. At first, I thought perhaps I had moved it myself. I searched the drawers, flipped through the piles of mail, even checked the wastebasket. Nothing. My heart sank as I pressed my hand against the cool metal of the refrigerator door. The absence of that little slip of paper filled the room like a missing heartbeat. I turned slowly, my eyes falling on Clara, who was at the stove stirring a pot of oatmeal. She turned and smiled at me, a smile so sudden and sweet it almost startled me. "Good morning, Margaret," she said brightly, too brightly. "I made enough for you as well. Why don't you sit down?" Her voice was syrupy, her tone uncharacteristically warm. Clara had never been unkind, but her affection was usually reserved for her son or her husband. This performance of hospitality felt staged, almost rehearsed. She placed a bowl in front of me, adding a spoonful of honey the way she knew I liked it, and patted my shoulder. It was the kind of gesture I had longed for, but instead of comforting me, it deepened my suspicion. I lifted the spoon slowly, my appetite gone. "Clara," I said softly, "have you seen the ticket I left on the fridge?" Her eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, before she answered. "Oh, that old thing? I thought you tucked it away somewhere safe." She returned to the stove without waiting for me to reply. My stomach knotted. I knew her well enough to recognize when she was concealing something. That tiny slip of hesitation told me more than her words ever could. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Ethan returned from work earlier than usual, his mood electric. He kissed Clara on the cheek, clapped Victor on the back, and barely acknowledged me as I sat with my tea. They huddled together in the living room, whispering, chuckling, Victor's voice rising in bursts of triumph. When I entered the room, the conversation fell silent. Ethan smiled at me, a smile I had never seen before, sharp, cold, almost predatory. "Mom," he said casually, "we're thinking of celebrating this weekend. Maybe a dinner out, maybe something bigger. You'll see." His words were vague, but the gleam in his eyes told me everything. He thought the future had already been decided. He thought the winning numbers were his to claim. I looked at Victor, lounging on the sofa with his shoes still on, and saw the satisfaction written across his face. The ticket was gone, but the magnet on the refrigerator mocked me, its painted grin daring me to question what I already knew. That evening, Clara invited me to join them at the table for dinner. She poured me a glass of wine without my asking, and she laughed at Ethan's jokes as though nothing were wrong. She even asked about my day, leaning forward as if eager to hear my answer. It should have been a moment of warmth, but all I could feel was the chill of betrayal creeping closer. Their gestures were too deliberate, too synchronized, like actors in a play that excluded me from its script. As I sat there, pushing food around my plate, my gaze drifted toward Oliver. He sat quietly, his fork moving slowly, his eyes flicking from his parents to me. He seemed to sense the tension, his small shoulders stiff, his lips pressed into a thin line. When our eyes met, he gave me a look that was both protective and worried, as though he understood more than a child should. I wanted to reach out, to reassure him, but the silence between us was thick with secrets. After dinner, I excused myself and returned to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to calm the racing of my thoughts. The missing ticket weighed heavily on me, more than the storm that had driven me out days before. I thought about the promises made in laughter years ago, the rituals we once cherished, and the swing I had dreamed of. All of it now seemed fragile, dangling by the thread of a single piece of paper. I knew then that the game had already begun, though I had not chosen to play. They had taken the ticket, convinced themselves of their victory, and expected me to remain silent, powerless. But silence does not always mean defeat. Sometimes it means watching, waiting, listening. Sometimes it means gathering strength in stillness until the moment arrives to speak. That night, as the house settled into quiet, I rose and returned to the kitchen. The red magnet still clung stubbornly to the refrigerator, its painted smile unbothered by the betrayal unfolding around it. I reached out and pressed it flat against the door, feeling the cool metal beneath my palm. I whispered to myself, "This is not the end." And in the darkness, with the magnet as my witness, I began to see the faint outline of a path forward. The announcement came on a Friday evening, sudden and theatrical, as though Ethan had rehearsed it in his head 100 times. I was sitting in the living room, my knitting needles in hand, when he strode in with Clara at his side and Victor trailing behind like a shadow. Ethan's smile was wide, his chest puffed out with a pride that seemed too large for the walls of the house. He held a glass of whiskey, raising it as if he were already standing on a stage. "We did it," he proclaimed, his voice booming. "We hit it. $22 million. The room went quiet for a heartbeat before Victor erupted in laughter, clapping Ethan on the back. Clara forced a smile, her eyes flicking toward me only briefly before settling on the floor. My needles stilled in my lap, the yarn pooling like a forgotten thread. I looked at my son, the man I had raised from a boy with scraped knees and second-hand shoes, and I could not recognize him in that moment. His triumph was a stranger's. "We?" I asked softly, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "Yes, Mom," Ethan said, but the word carried no warmth. "We, as in Clara, Victor, and me. We're the ones who will decide what to do, how to spend it. Finally, we can live the life we deserve." His smile grew sharper as he took a long sip from his glass. He never once acknowledged me as part of that future. The "we" did not include me. I pressed my hands against the yarn in my lap, grounding myself. I remembered all the promises made years ago, the afternoons in Mr. Cole's shop, the childish declarations that we would share everything. But those memories seemed like faded photographs now, edges curling, colors drained. My silence must have unsettled him, because Ethan's smile faltered for a moment before he added, "Of course you'll be taken care of, Mom. You don't need to worry about anything." The words sounded rehearsed, meant more for Clara and Victor than for me. Clara shifted in her seat, her fingers twisting the edge of her sweater. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and I thought I saw conflict flicker there, but she looked away quickly. Victor, meanwhile, leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, grinning at me as though daring me to question their story. Ethan raised his glass higher. "To freedom, to fortune, to the future." He downed the rest of the drink in one swallow, then slammed the glass on the table, the sound ringing through the room. I sat still, my face calm, my heart beating steadily despite the storm inside. I wanted to ask him if he remembered the promises, if he remembered the nights we dreamed not of mansions or cars, but of a porch swing and peace. But I knew the question would fall on deaf ears. So I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, let it fill the room until Ethan shifted uncomfortably, until Victor looked at me with a smirk that couldn't hide his unease. "Don't you have anything to say, Mom?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising slightly. I looked at him and offered the smallest of smiles. "Congratulations." The word hung in the air like smoke, too thin to grasp, yet thick enough to choke him. His jaw tightened, and for the briefest second, doubt clouded his eyes. Then he turned away, brushing off the moment with a forced laugh. They began talking quickly after that, plans for new cars, vacations abroad, investments Victor claimed he could manage. Clara listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap, nodding when expected but rarely speaking. I watched her carefully, noting the tightness in her jaw, the way her eyes sometimes strayed toward Oliver's empty chair. My grandson was at a friend's house that evening, spared from the spectacle, though I knew he would feel its weight soon enough. The conversation swirled around me, words of extravagance and entitlement, a chorus of greed that drowned out reason. I sat quietly, observing, letting each sentence etch itself into my memory. They spoke as if the world had already shifted in their favor, as if nothing could undo the certainty of their victory. But beneath their laughter, I sensed the fragility of their triumph, a thin shell waiting for the slightest pressure to crack. When the evening finally wound down, Clara gathered the glasses and plates, moving with mechanical precision. Ethan disappeared into the study with Victor, their voices muffled but animated. I remained in my chair, staring at the yarn tangled in my lap, my fingers tracing the loops absent-mindedly. I felt the weight of disappointment pressing against my chest, heavier than the storm had been days before. Yet beneath the disappointment was something else, a steadiness, a knowledge that ran deeper than their boasts. They thought the victory was theirs alone, but I knew the truth. I had signed that ticket with my own hand. My name was written across its back, quiet but indelible. They had overlooked it, blinded by greed, but I had not. When Clara returned from the kitchen, she paused by the doorway, her eyes lingering on me. For a moment, her lips parted as though she might speak, but she closed them again and turned away. I watched her retreat, wondering if the sweetness she had shown in the kitchen the day before was guilt or a warning, or both. As the house settled into uneasy quiet, I gathered my knitting and rose. I walked past the study where Ethan and Victor's voices still rose and fell, past the kitchen where Clara stood motionless, staring out the window into the night. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step measured, each breath steady. In my room, I closed the door gently and sat on the edge of the bed. The night was thick with silence, but inside me something stirred, not anger, not despair, but resolve. I had been cast aside, dismissed, treated as an afterthought in the very home I had built. Yet I knew the story was far from over. The lottery was not simply a number drawn on television. It was a bond, a promise, a piece of paper that carried more than wealth. It carried my name. The days after Ethan's declaration were strangely quiet, as if the house itself held its breath. He stopped speaking to me except for clipped commands, and Clara moved about with a stiff politeness that only deepened the gulf between us. One morning I awoke to the sound of footsteps and muted voices. I pulled aside the curtain and saw a moving truck parked by the curb. My son was carrying boxes, his head bent low, his movements hurried. Clara followed behind him, her arms full, her eyes darting around as though she feared being seen. They had not told me a thing. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and stepped outside. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of wet grass. Mrs. Turner, my neighbor for nearly 30 years, stood at the edge of her driveway, watching with narrowed eyes. She leaned on her cane, her thin frame braced against the morning wind. When she noticed me, she shook her head slowly. "They didn't even bother to say goodbye," she murmured, her voice carrying across the space between us. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. I watched as Victor barked orders to the movers, pointing with a cigarette clutched between his fingers. Ethan glanced at me once, then looked away quickly, his jaw set. It was as though I had already been erased from their story, a burden packed away with the things they no longer needed. Mrs. Turner shuffled closer. "You don't deserve this, Margaret," she said firmly. "I've seen the way you've carried that family on your back for years. This is no way for a son to treat his mother." Her words warmed me, though they also stung. I hated that others could see my humiliation so plainly. I turned back toward the house, and that's when I noticed Oliver. My grandson stood a little apart from the chaos, clutching his backpack. His eyes searched for me, and when they found mine, he slipped something from his pocket and held it tightly in his hand. As the movers bustled around him, he darted toward me with the kind of quickness only a child could manage. He pressed a small folded note into my palm and whispered, "Grandma, you're the real key." His voice trembled, but his eyes were steady. Before I could respond, Clara called his name sharply, and Oliver scurried back to her side. I slipped the note into my sleeve, my heart pounding. The words echoed in my mind as I watched them load the last of the boxes into the truck. The engine roared to life, and in moments they were gone. The driveway, once filled with the laughter of birthdays and holidays, stood empty. I returned to my kitchen, the silence pressing against me like a weight. I sat at the table and unfolded the note with trembling fingers. The letters were uneven, written in the careful hand of a 12-year-old, but they carried more strength than any declaration of victory my son had made. "Grandma, you're the real key." I traced the words with my fingertip, tears welling in my eyes. He knew. He had seen what others overlooked. In his simple way, he reminded me that I was not powerless, that my place in this story was far from over. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Turner knocked gently on my door. She brought a small plate of cookies, still warm, and sat with me at the table. "You have people who care," she said softly. "Don't let him make you forget that." Her presence was a balm, a reminder that family is not always defined by blood, but by those who choose to stand beside you. As evening fell, I sat by the window holding Oliver's note close to my heart. The house was emptier now, but in the quiet, I felt a flicker of strength. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the nights I stayed late at the library, the meals I skipped to save money for Ethan's school trips, the dreams I had shelved to give him chances I never had. Those sacrifices were not erased by his cruelty. They lived in me, in the memories of the boy he once was, and in the love of a grandson who saw more clearly than the adults around him. When darkness settled fully, I lit a single candle on the table. Its flame flickered against the walls, casting long shadows. I whispered to myself, "This is not where my story ends." For the first time in many days, my chest loosened, and I felt the faintest smile tug at my lips. Ethan might have taken the house, the ticket, and the comfort of belonging, but he had not taken my resolve. And he had not taken Oliver's quiet loyalty, a thread of light weaving through the dark. I blew out the candle, letting the smoke curl upward, and pressed the folded note back into my pocket. Tomorrow would bring challenges I could not yet name, but I knew this much. I was not defeated. I was still here, still standing, and in my silence, I carried a truth my son had overlooked. I woke the next morning with Oliver's note still folded in my hand. The words had burned themselves into me through the night. "Grandma, you're the real key." I couldn't stop turning them over in my mind. A child's handwriting, uneven and rushed, yet steady in its truth. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold, staring at the window where the dawn light filtered through. That was when a memory surfaced so clearly, it felt as though it had been waiting for me all along. Weeks earlier, after buying the ticket at Mr. Cole's gas station, I had turned it over in my hand. Something had urged me, an instinct, perhaps years of caution from managing every bill and record on my own after my husband's death. Without much thought, I had pulled out a pen from my purse and signed my name on the back of the ticket in my neat librarian's script. Margaret Hensley. I remembered the steady press of the ballpoint ink, the certainty of my letters. At the time, it seemed like nothing, a small act of habit, but now it struck me with the force of revelation. My name was there. Not Ethan's, not Clara's, not Victor's. Mine. I set the cup down, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the realization of what it meant. That ticket, wherever they kept it now, bore my mark. The law recognized that mark. For all their arrogance and declarations, they had overlooked the simplest truth. Ownership was not just in possession, but in proof. I rose from the table and walked to my desk, pulling open the drawer where I kept old receipts and letters. I rummaged through them until I found a faded envelope addressed to me in my late husband's hand. I traced his writing with my finger, steadying myself with the memory of his presence. He had always told me to trust my instincts, to believe that my careful ways would protect me when the world grew unkind. He had been right. I pulled out a notebook and began to write. I wrote the date of purchase, the time, the place. I wrote about Mr. Cole, who had rung up the sale, about how I had stood at the counter and signed the back of the ticket before slipping it into my purse. I wrote every detail I could recall, no matter how small, because memory fades, but ink preserves. When I looked down at the page, I felt steadier, as though I had anchored myself to something immovable. The house was quiet, but in my mind I could still hear Ethan's voice ringing with triumph, declaring, "We did it." I thought about his face, so sure of himself, and I almost pitied him. He believed possession was enough. He believed that by raising his glass and surrounding himself with people who fed his ego, he could rewrite the truth. But the truth doesn't bow to arrogance. It waits, silent and patient, until the moment it is called upon. By mid-morning, I found myself walking to the small community library where I had worked for decades. The building was the same, though I was no longer employed there. Inside, the smell of paper and ink greeted me, and I sat at one of the wooden tables with my notes. I pulled a law handbook from the shelf, one I had recommended to students many times, and flipped through the pages. I read about contracts, signatures, the binding weight of written names. The more I read, the more certain I became. That ticket was not just a slip of paper, it was a signed document. And my signature gave it life. I spent hours there, scribbling in my notebook, cross-referencing passages. Each confirmation built upon the next, like bricks forming a wall. By the time the sun shifted low in the sky, I knew what I carried. I was not simply a mother betrayed by her son. I was the rightful owner of the very thing he boasted about. On my way home, I passed Mr. Cole's station. The bell over the door chimed as I stepped inside. He looked up from behind the counter, his lined face breaking into a kind smile. "Margaret," he greeted, "haven't seen you in a bit." I returned his smile faintly. "You might not remember, but I bought a ticket here a while back. Do you happen to recall it?" He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "You mean the one with all the excitement lately?" "Yeah, I sold that ticket. You signed it right here at the counter. I remember because you told me you always signed them for safety." My heart swelled at his words. "Would you be willing to confirm that, if it ever came to it?" "Of course," he said without hesitation. "You've been a loyal customer for years. I'd stand by what I saw." I thanked him and left the store, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. For the first time in days, I felt taller, my steps firmer. The betrayal still stung. The loss of my home still ached. But now I had something they could not take away. Proof. That night, I sat again at my kitchen table, Oliver's note before me, and my own notes stacked neatly at my side. I whispered aloud, "Grandma, you're the real key." He had known more than I realized. He had trusted me to see what others missed. And he was right. I folded my papers carefully and placed them in a folder. As I slid it into the drawer, I felt a calm resolve settle over me. Ethan thought he had locked me out of his life, but he had forgotten the simplest truth. I had already secured my place in this story the moment I signed my name. I did not have to search long to see what Ethan was doing with his so-called victory. In this age, people announce their triumphs to the world before they have even settled into them. My son was no different. One evening, while sipping tea at the small kitchen table, I opened the tablet Oliver had once used for his homework and typed Ethan's name into the search bar. What appeared made my stomach tighten. There he was, standing in front of a gleaming new car, its paint catching the sun like liquid fire. Clara stood beside him in the photo, her smile stretched too wide, her eyes shadowed with something I recognized as unease. Victor lingered behind them, his arm draped over Ethan's shoulder like a crown he had appointed himself to place. The caption read, "From nothing to 22 million, hard work pays off." Hard work. The words nearly made me laugh. He had not even worked for the ticket. He had not even seen the name scrawled across its back. I scrolled further. Photos of dinners in glittering restaurants, glasses of champagne raised high, Victor's grin wider than ever. Ethan tagged Clara in posts that called her the luckiest wife alive. In one video, he even called me out by name, his tone dripping with scorn. "Some people just drain you dry," he said, lifting his glass. "But not anymore. We cut ties with the leeches. We're free." Clara sat beside him, nodding faintly, though her hands clenched around her napkin. I watched her carefully, pausing the video to study her face. She looked trapped, caught between the performance and her conscience. The comments below the posts were full of strangers congratulating them, marveling at their sudden wealth. No one knew the truth. No one saw the ticket in my hand, my signature pressed firmly into the paper. To the world, I was invisible, erased from the narrative my son crafted with Victor's encouragement. But invisibility can be powerful. When no one sees you, they do not realize you are watching, listening, gathering. What stung most was not Ethan's arrogance, but Oliver's fleeting appearances. In one photo, he stood at the edge of the frame, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. He looked so out of place amid the glittering glasses and forced smiles, a child swallowed by a world too sharp for his age. My heart ached to reach through the screen and pull him close, to remind him he was not alone in seeing through the facade. I closed the tablet, but the images lingered. Ethan with his glass raised high, Victor whispering in his ear, Clara caught between loyalty and guilt, Oliver fading into the background. It was a gallery of betrayal disguised as celebration. Yet I felt no despair. Instead, I felt the slow, steady burn of resolve. Each boast was another brick in the wall they built around themselves, a wall I knew would soon collapse under the weight of truth. The next day, as I walked through the neighborhood, Mrs. Turner called me over. She had seen the photos too, shared through the grapevine of gossip that always runs quicker than the wind. "He's showing off," she said with a sigh, "but you and I both know pride comes before the fall." She patted my hand, her eyes kind but firm. "Don't let his words cut you down. People like him don't understand that life has a way of balancing itself." Her reassurance stayed with me as I returned home. I sat at the table again, opening my notebook where I had recorded the details of my purchase. I added more now, screenshots of Ethan's posts, dates, captions, the cruel words he had spoken about me. Evidence, I reminded myself. Every careless boast he made publicly was another thread tying him to his own undoing. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself staring at Oliver's note once more. "Grandma, you're the real key." He had known. He had seen what his parents could not admit. I imagined him at those dinners, watching the adults laugh too loudly, drink too much, boast too freely. I imagined his small hands folded under the table, clutching the truth like a secret too heavy to share. My heart swelled with both sorrow and pride. I knew then that I could not allow Ethan's story to stand unchallenged. He was writing a false narrative for the world to applaud. But I had the real story, signed in ink and carried in silence. For years, I had lived quietly, sacrificing for him, believing that patience and love would be enough. Now I understood that silence must be sharpened, must become the blade of justice rather than the shield of submission. Before bed, I scrolled through his feed once more. Another post had gone up, Ethan in a designer suit, Clara by his side, Victor grinning like a fox. The caption read, "This is just the beginning. We deserve every cent." I stared at the words until they blurred, then set the tablet down with care. They believed the beginning was theirs alone. But I knew better. The beginning was mine too, and the ending would not be what they imagined. I turned off the light, lying awake with the moonlight spilling across the room. My heart no longer beat with humiliation or grief. It beat with certainty. I had what mattered most, and they could not erase it with photographs, dinners, or cruel words. The truth waited quietly in my drawer, in Mr. Cole's memory, in Oliver's note, and in the steadiness of my resolve. The world might not know it yet, but the day would come when their boasting would be silenced, and my name would be spoken clearly for all to hear. After days of silence and watching from a distance, I decided to return to the oldest parts of my home, to the places where memories lingered even when people tried to erase them. I pulled open the oak dresser in my bedroom, its drawers creaking with age, filled with scraps of my past. Letters from my husband, photographs of Ethan as a boy, receipts carefully folded from years when every penny counted. I searched not only for comfort, but for something tangible, something that could anchor my memory to evidence. It was in the bottom drawer, under a stack of yellowed envelopes, that I found a small packet of photographs. Most were of birthdays and school concerts, moments I had captured to remind myself that our life, though modest, was still full of joy. As I flipped through them, one photograph slipped free, its glossy surface catching the light. My breath caught. It was a picture of the lottery ticket itself. Weeks before, I had taken the photo absent-mindedly, using the small camera I often carried. I had been recording little things then, as though cataloging my daily life could preserve some measure of control. In the photograph, the numbers were clear, printed in neat rows. The date and time of purchase were stamped at the edge, and there, faint but visible, was the mark of my signature across the back. I stared at it for a long moment, the edges trembling between my fingers. I pressed the photograph flat against the table, tracing the numbers with my fingertip. Proof. The kind that could not be argued away, the kind that even arrogance could not deny. My heart steadied, the same way it had when I wrote my notes in the library. Each discovery was another thread pulling the truth together, weaving it into something unbreakable. I thought of Ethan then, his laughter echoing through the restaurant in the video, his glass raised as he dismissed me publicly. I thought of Victor's hand clapping his shoulder, urging him toward arrogance. I thought of Clara's clenched jaw, her silence louder than her agreement. And I thought of Oliver, slipping me that note with his small, determined hands. The photograph was not just proof of ownership. It was a reminder of all that had been betrayed and all that still remained to fight for. I placed the photo into the folder where I had been collecting evidence. My notes, the screenshots of Ethan's posts, and now this. I handled each page with care, stacking them neatly, aligning the edges as though order itself could give me strength. As a librarian, I had always believed in the power of documents, the permanence of ink and record. Now that belief became my shield. Later that afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and set the photo on the counter, leaning over it in the light of the window. Clara had once stood there, her face too sweet, her hands stirring oatmeal that carried the flavor of guilt. Now the counter held the image of the truth they had tried to hide. I whispered aloud, "You cannot erase me." As the day faded into evening, I heard laughter outside. Through the window, I saw my neighbors gathered, murmuring about the headlines they had read and the photos they had seen. Ethan was parading his new wealth so publicly that even strangers knew his story. Yet none of them knew mine. I held the photograph tightly, feeling its edges dig into my palm, a sharp reminder that my silence was not weakness. It was preparation. When the house grew quiet, I returned to my desk. I wrote again in my notebook, describing the photograph, recording the date I had taken it, noting the details visible. I slid the photo into a protective sleeve, the kind I had once used to preserve rare pages in the library. I smiled faintly at the thought. All my years among books and records had prepared me for this moment. Others might underestimate paper, but I knew better. Paper speaks. Paper endures. Before bed, I pulled Oliver's note from my pocket and placed it beside the photograph. The two pieces of paper, one scrawled by a child and one printed by a machine, lay together as if in conversation. Both told the same truth in different languages, that I was not powerless, that I was not erased, that I was still the key to everything. I closed my eyes with the knowledge that while Ethan flaunted his illusions of power, I held the quiet certainty of evidence. That night, sleep came more easily than it had in weeks. My dreams were not of betrayal, but of a porch swing, finally built, swaying gently in the breeze. I woke at dawn with the image still in my mind, my heart steadier than it had been since the night of the storm. The path forward was becoming clear. Step by step, piece by piece, I was gathering what I needed. The photograph was not just a picture. It was a beginning. The morning I decided to return to Mr. Cole's gas station, the air was brisk with the scent of autumn leaves. My hands shook slightly as I buttoned my coat, but it was not fear that unsettled me. It was anticipation. I had my notebook tucked neatly in my bag, the photograph of the ticket in its sleeve, Oliver's note folded carefully in my pocket. Each piece felt like a stone laid into the foundation of something solid, something no storm of arrogance could wash away. When I pushed open the glass door of the station, the familiar chime of the bell greeted me. The place looked the same as it had for years. Shelves lined with snacks, the hum of the old refrigerator, the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the pot by the counter. Mr. Cole stood where he always did, behind the register, his glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up, and his face broke into a smile. "Margaret," he said warmly, "haven't seen you in a while. How are you holding up?" I offered a small smile. "One day at a time, Mr. Cole. I came because I need to ask you for something important." He leaned forward, concern softening his lined face. "Anything." I took a deep breath. "Do you remember the day I bought the lottery ticket here? The one everyone's been talking about?" He adjusted his glasses, nodding slowly. Of course I do. You stood right there at the counter, signed the back of it before you even left. I remember because I joked that you must have the luck of a gambler's wife, always so careful. Relief washed through me. Would you be willing to say that to someone official, if it came to it? His answer came without hesitation. You bet I would. Margaret, I've known you for 30 years. You've never been anything but honest. If you say that ticket is yours, I'll stand by it. I felt my throat tighten with gratitude. Thank you. There's more, though. I need to know if your cameras were running that day. Mr. Cole's brows lifted. They were. We upgraded the system last year. Records go back months. He tapped the counter, thoughtful. Give me a second. He disappeared into the small office behind the counter, and I stood there with my heart pounding in my ears. The seconds stretched until he returned carrying a hard drive and a laptop. He set it on the counter, the screen glowing faintly as he pulled up the files. What day was it again? I told him, and he scrolled through the timestamps until the feed appeared. And there I was, grainy but clear, standing at the counter with my purse slung over my arm. The camera showed me pulling out a pen, turning the ticket over, and signing my name. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was undeniable. Mr. Cole leaned closer, nodding firmly. There it is, proof as plain as day. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. For so long I had felt erased, invisible in my own life. Now, in the black and white glow of the footage, I saw myself preserved, my actions undeniable. My signature had weight. My presence could not be ignored. Can I get a copy of this? I asked softly. Of course, he said, already clicking through menus. Within minutes, he had transferred the file onto a flash drive and pressed it into my hand. Keep this safe, Margaret. It might be worth more than the ticket itself. I held it tightly, the small plastic case warm against my palm. Thank you, Mr. Cole. You don't know what this means to me. He smiled kindly. I think I do. Sometimes the truth takes its time to show itself, but it always does. I left the station with the drive tucked deep in my pocket, the autumn wind cool against my face. For the first time in weeks, my steps felt lighter. The road stretched out before me, lined with trees whose leaves burned orange and gold in the sunlight. Each leaf drifting down reminded me that endings can be beautiful when they lead to something new. When I reached home, I sat at my kitchen table and placed the flash drive beside the photograph of the ticket and Oliver's note. 3 small objects, each unassuming on their own, but together they formed a story no one could refute. I laid my hand over them, feeling their quiet strength, and whispered, "You tried to erase me, Ethan, but I am still here." That evening, I opened my notebook and added another entry. I described my visit to the gas station, the way the footage clearly showed my hand signing the ticket, the certainty in Mr. Cole's voice. I wrote down the timestamp, the date, every detail that could matter. Then I slid the flash drive into the protective sleeve with the photograph, sealing them together. The house was quiet, but inside me there was a steady hum, like the low rhythm of a drum beat before a march begins. I thought again of Ethan's boasting online, of Victor's grin, of Clara's silence, and of Oliver's eyes filled with more truth than any adult around him. They believed their performance would stand unchallenged, but I had gathered the unseen chorus of evidence, each note stronger than their noise. Before bed, I returned once more to the drawer where I kept the folder. I placed it gently inside, closing the wood with care. The sound of it sliding shut was like the closing of a chapter, but not the book itself. That was still being written. I stood by the window, the moonlight spilling across the floor, and I let the silence wrap around me, not as loneliness, but as strength. Silence was no longer my prison. It was my preparation. I knew I could not carry the burden of this truth alone forever. Evidence mattered, yes, but evidence needed a voice stronger than mine, someone who could shape it into a force no one could deny. That was how I found myself walking up the stone steps of a modest law office on the edge of town, my folder clutched tightly against my chest. The sign above the door read, Grace Miller, Attorney at Law. I had heard of her before, A woman with a reputation for fairness and precision, someone unshaken by intimidation. Inside, the office smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paper. A receptionist greeted me kindly and led me into a sunlit room where Grace sat behind a desk piled neatly with files. She looked up as I entered, her dark hair pulled into a tidy knot, her expression sharp but not unkind. "Mrs. Hensley," she said, rising to shake my hand. "Please, sit down. What brings you to me today?" Her tone was professional, but there was something in her eyes that made me feel I could trust her. I opened my folder with trembling hands and slid the photograph across the desk. "I need help," I said quietly. "This ticket is mine. My son has taken it, claimed it as his, and pushed me out of my own home. But I signed it. I bought it, and I have proof." Grace studied the photo for a long moment, then looked back at me. "Go on," she said. I told her everything. About the storm, about Ethan's words at the door, about Clara's sudden sweetness, about Victor's smirks. I described the disappearance of the ticket from the refrigerator door, the false celebration, the online boasts, the cruel video where Ethan dismissed me as a leech. Then I spoke of Oliver's note, the photograph of the ticket, and finally, the visit to Mr. Cole's station, the footage that showed me signing my name. I laid the flash drive on her desk like a final card in a game I had never asked to play. Grace listened without interrupting, her pen moving swiftly across a legal pad as I spoke. When I finished, the silence between us was steady, thoughtful, not dismissive. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "Mrs. Hensley," she said firmly, "what your son has done is not just immoral, it's criminal. He has attempted to pass off your property as his own. That is fraud. And the act of taking the ticket itself, if you did not give it to him freely, can be considered theft." Her words landed with a clarity I had not dared to speak aloud. Theft, fraud, the names of what he had done. I felt my breath catch in my throat, but instead of breaking me, the weight of those words steadied me. Grace reached for the flash drive, sliding it into her computer. The footage appeared, grainy but undeniable. She watched carefully, then nodded. "This is strong evidence. Combined with your signature and the photograph, it creates a case that will stand. We can file an injunction immediately to freeze any payout until ownership is resolved." I pressed my hands together in my lap. "Do you think we can win?" She met my gaze, unwavering. "This isn't about winning or losing, Mrs. Hensley. This is about the truth. And the truth is on your side. Once the Lottery Commission sees this evidence, they cannot release funds to your son. We'll make sure of that." The certainty in her voice wrapped around me like armor. For weeks I had lived under humiliation, cast aside as though my life's worth could be measured in inconvenience. But now, sitting across from this woman who spoke with calm authority, I felt seen again, not as a burden, not as a victim, as someone who still held power. Grace pulled a stack of forms from a drawer and began to explain the process. How she would file the paperwork, how we would present the evidence, how the payout would be frozen until the matter was settled in court. Her words were precise, but beneath them was something stronger: conviction. She believed me, believed in me, in a way my own son had refused to. When I left her office, the sun was setting, casting long golden streaks across the sidewalk. I held the folder close, now thicker with her notes and copies of the filings. Each step felt lighter, as though the weight I had carried since that stormy night was finally shifting. I whispered to myself, "You are not erased. You are not invisible. The law sees you." At home, I placed the folder back in its drawer, laying Oliver's note on top of it. The words, "You're the real key," seemed to shine brighter now, as though my grandson had known all along that the key was not just love, but proof. I sat at the table with a cup of tea and let the quiet fill me, not as loneliness, but as a calm before the storm to come. That night, for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. Ethan thought the victory was his, parading his wealth for strangers to applaud. But while he flaunted, I built. While he boasted, I gathered. And now, with Grace at my side, the foundation of truth was no longer fragile. It was strong, steady, ready. The call from Grace came 2 mornings later, crisp and direct. "It's done," she said. "The Lottery Commission has been notified. The payout is frozen until the court decides ownership. Your son will find out soon enough." Her words echoed in my ears long after we hung up. For the first time since that stormy night, I felt the ground beneath me steady, as though justice had begun to stir awake. I didn't have to wait long to see the effects. That afternoon, while walking back from the library with a book tucked under my arm, I passed the cafe on Main Street. Through the glass, I caught sight of Ethan and Victor sitting together. Ethan's phone was in his hand, his expression twisted in disbelief. He shook the screen as if the device itself had betrayed him. Victor leaned over, his face darkening, and I could almost hear his voice, sharp and angry. Clara sat across from them, her eyes wide, her coffee untouched. I stopped just outside, hidden partly by the awning. Ethan's voice carried even through the glass. "Declined? What do you mean, declined? There's $22 million waiting, and my card just got rejected." His fist struck the table, rattling the cups. Victor hissed something back, his grin gone, replaced with the look of a cornered man. Clara pressed her hands together in her lap, her gaze flicking between them, and for a brief moment her eyes lifted toward the window. They landed on me, though I don't think she truly saw me. She looked through me, dazed, as if waking from a dream that had turned sour. I walked away before they could notice me, but the image stayed with me. The first cracks had begun to show. Pride had carried them this far, but pride does not pay the bills. That evening, Clara called me. Her voice trembled. "Margaret, I don't know what's happening. Ethan says there's some kind of mistake with the lottery office. The money isn't coming through. Do you know anything about it?" I let her words hang in the air for a moment before answering. "Sometimes the truth takes time to surface," I said quietly. "Sometimes it waits until people have shown who they truly are." There was silence on the other end, broken only by a faint, shaky breath. "I didn't know he'd go this far," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought it was just excitement. I never wanted this." I didn't comfort her. Not yet. Some lessons must settle on their own. The following day, reports spread quickly. Ethan had tried to access the funds, only to be told that a legal claim had been filed. Neighbors whispered, gossip traveled faster than the wind, and soon even Mrs. Turner knocked on my door. "He's in a fury," she said, lowering her voice. "Word is he shouted at the bank teller until security asked him to leave." She shook her head. "I've lived long enough to know money can't buy peace. It can only reveal character." That night, Oliver came to see me. He slipped away from his parents, knocking softly at my door. When I opened it, he stood there with his backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes brimming with worry. "Grandma," he said, "Dad's really mad. He keeps yelling at Mom and Mr. Victor. He said someone froze the money." I crouched down so we were eye to eye. "Oliver," I said gently, "sometimes grown-ups make choices that lead them into storms. But storms pass. You don't have to be afraid of the thunder." He nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out another scrap of paper. This one simply read, "I believe you." My throat tightened as I hugged him close, his small body shaking against mine. The next morning, I saw Ethan himself. He stormed up my walkway, unannounced, his face red, his movements frantic. "What did you do?" he shouted, not bothering with greetings. "Don't play innocent with me. You know something about this. They froze the money, Mom. The bank says there's an investigation. You ruined everything." I stood in the doorway, steady as stone. "I did nothing but live my life," I said calmly. "If there is an investigation, then perhaps it is because the truth is finally speaking." His eyes blazed with fury, but behind the fire, I saw fear. Victor had hung back at the curb, his expression dark, his phone pressed to his ear as though calculating his next move. Clara stood further away, arms crossed, her face pale. She did not defend him this time. She simply watched, her silence cutting deeper than any words could. Ethan cursed under his breath and turned away, pacing like a trapped animal. I did not move from the doorway. I let him feel the weight of his own panic, the collapse of his illusion. When they left, the silence that followed was sweeter than any victory song. I returned inside and poured myself a cup of tea, sitting at the table with Oliver's note in my hand. The house was still, the candlelight flickering softly, and for the first time I felt the tide had turned. The chaos was theirs now, not mine. Their cards were being declined, their voices rising in panic, their nights restless with worry. I, meanwhile, sat in quiet certainty, my evidence safe in its drawer, my ally Grace ready to act. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of the storm that had driven me out weeks earlier. The rain had soaked me through, stripped me of dignity, left me trembling in the dark. But storms are not endless. They pass, leaving the air clearer than before. And now, as Ethan and Victor scrambled in their fury, I could finally see the sky breaking open, pale and calm. That night, after the shouting at my doorstep and the chaos of seeing Ethan unravel, I sat alone in the quiet of my kitchen. The candlelight flickered across the walls, and I let the silence seep into me, not as emptiness, but as space to breathe. For weeks, I had been carrying anger and disbelief like stones in my chest, but now I felt something softer rising. Memories, long buried under the noise of betrayal, began to surface. I remembered the years when Ethan was small, and it was just the two of us after my husband passed. Money was always tight, but I never let him see how many nights I went without so he could have enough. I used to cut coupons from the paper, carefully planning meals that would stretch across days. Once I went nearly 3 months without buying myself new shoes because he needed cleats for soccer. My soles were worn thin, but I smiled when I saw him running across the field, his face lit with joy. I remembered giving up smoking after my husband's death, not because I didn't crave the comfort, but because every dollar mattered. I would sit by the window at night, my hands trembling, whispering to myself that the money saved could buy Ethan a better future. The smell of smoke lingered in my memory, but it was replaced by the sound of his laughter, and that was enough. There was the winter when the heating bills soared higher than I could manage. I bundled myself in layers, wrapping blankets around my shoulders while I kept the thermostat low so he wouldn't know how close we were to running out of money. He never noticed because I made hot cocoa every night, distracting him with stories from the books I borrowed from the library. My own fingers ached with cold, but his cheeks were flushed with warmth. I remembered the countless nights I stayed at the library after hours, volunteering for extra shifts, cataloging books in silence so that I could earn just enough to keep us afloat. My body ached, my eyes strained, but I told myself it was worth it if Ethan never had to feel poor. Every dollar went toward his needs, his education, his dreams. I sacrificed, not because I wanted recognition, but because it was what mothers do. We give until we are nearly empty, hoping the child will one day understand. And then there was the porch swing. I had dreamed of it for years, a small luxury, nothing extravagant. I had seen one in the hardware store window once, painted white, the chains sturdy, the seat wide enough for two. I told myself that one day, when Ethan was settled and we were comfortable, I would buy it. A place to sit in the evenings with tea, to rest my weary bones, to feel the breeze against my face. But each time I saved a little, something came up. His school trip, his braces, the car breaking down. The swing was always postponed, set aside for his sake, and eventually I stopped mentioning it altogether. Now, as I sat at the kitchen table, the memories layered themselves like pages in a book, each one heavy with sacrifice, but also threaded with love. I did not regret what I had given, but I could not deny the ache of realizing how quickly he had forgotten. Perhaps he had never truly seen what it cost me to give him everything. Perhaps he believed comfort had always been his by right. The flame of the candle flickered, and I placed my hand over Oliver's note once more. That little scrap of paper, scrawled in his childlike hand, reminded me that not all was lost. Someone saw me. Someone noticed, and that knowledge healed a part of me I hadn't realized was broken. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. In the darkness, I saw myself younger, holding Ethan's hand on the walk to school, carrying a lunch I had packed from scraps, whispering encouragement as he faced the world. I saw myself sitting in the bleachers at his games, cheering louder than anyone, even when the cold seeped into my bones. I saw the nights I sat up with him when he was sick, wiping his forehead, humming softly to soothe him. All the little things, invisible in the moment, now came rushing back like a tide, and with the memories came something unexpected. Peace. I had given him my best. I had poured myself into his life, and even if he had turned cruel, it did not erase what I had done. My worth was not defined by his rejection. My worth was in the love I had given, in the strength I had built, in the quiet dignity that still lived within me. I opened my eyes and looked at the candle burning low. For the first time, I did not feel weighed down by betrayal. I felt steadied by the knowledge of who I was. Ethan could lie, Victor could sneer, Clara could falter, but none of them could erase the truth of my sacrifices. They were written into every breath I had taken for years. Before bed, I wrote one more entry in my notebook, not evidence this time, but memory. I listed each sacrifice I could recall, each moment I had chosen him over myself, each time I had silenced my own needs for his comfort. I wanted it written down, not as proof for a court, but as proof for myself. Proof that I had lived with love, that my life had not been wasted on bitterness. As I closed the notebook, I whispered to the quiet house, "I see you, Margaret. I see all that you gave." And with that, I blew out the candle and let the darkness settle, not as fear, but as rest. The day of the hearing arrived with a sharp chill in the air, as if even the weather knew something monumental was about to unfold. I dressed with care, choosing a simple navy dress and the pearl necklace my husband had given me on our 20th anniversary. As I stood before the mirror, I saw not a woman broken by betrayal, but someone steadied by years of survival, a woman who had faced storms and was still standing. When Grace arrived to pick me up, her presence was calm, professional, yet quietly reassuring. The courthouse was crowded that morning. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras flashing as soon as they caught sight of Ethan striding up with Clara and Victor at his side. He looked pale despite his attempt at bravado, his suit pressed, but his tie knotted carelessly. Victor whispered in his ear, gesturing with sharp movements, while Clara walked slightly behind them, her face pale and drawn. I followed Grace through the doors, my steps slower, but each one carried the weight of truth. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The judge presided from the bench, her expression stern, her gavel resting firmly at hand. Ethan sat across from me, his posture rigid, his jaw tight. When his eyes met mine, there was no warmth, only defiance. Yet I noticed the faintest tremor in his hand as he adjusted his tie. Clara sat beside him, her shoulders hunched, while Victor leaned back in his chair as though the outcome was already written in his favor. Grace rose to speak, her voice steady and precise. She laid out the evidence carefully, piece by piece, the signed ticket, the photograph, the screenshots of Ethan's public boasts, and finally, the footage from Mr. Cole's camera. The room grew quiet as the video played on the screen. There I was, clear enough to recognize, standing at the counter with my purse on my arm, signing the back of the ticket before slipping it into my wallet. The timestamp glowed in the corner. Mr. Cole had provided a statement as well, affirming what the footage showed. When the video ended, the silence in the room was deafening. Ethan's face drained of color, his mouth slightly open as though he could not believe what he had just seen. Victor shifted in his seat, his confidence faltering. Clara stared at the table, unable to lift her eyes. The judge leaned forward, her voice sharp. "The evidence is conclusive. The rightful owner of the winning lottery ticket is Mrs. Margaret Hensley. The commission is hereby ordered to release payment to her and her alone. Any claims made by Mr. Ethan Hensley are without merit." She struck the gavel, the sound echoing through the chamber like a final sentence. For a moment, the world seemed to hold still. Then whispers spread across the courtroom, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras clicking. Ethan slumped back in his chair, his face crumpling as the reality settled over him. Clara pressed her hands to her face, tears spilling silently. Victor stood abruptly, muttering curses under his breath as he stormed out of the room. Grace placed a steady hand on my shoulder, guiding me forward. Reporters crowded the hallway as we stepped out, their microphones thrust toward me, their voices overlapping with questions. How does it feel to win? What do you want to say to your son? What will you do with the money? I paused, lifting my chin. The flash of cameras illuminated the hallway, but I did not shy away. My name is Margaret Hensley, I said clearly. This ticket bore my signature from the very beginning. Today is not about fortune. It is about truth. No amount of money can heal the wounds of betrayal, but truth can bring dignity back to those who have been cast aside. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, even the reporters seemed struck silent. Then the questions began again, louder this time, but I did not waver. I let them take their photographs, let them record my face, because it was not shame they would capture. It was resolve. Outside, the cold air met my skin like a baptism, sharp but cleansing. Grace walked beside me, her calm presence anchoring me. I could hear Ethan's voice somewhere behind us, raised in anger, blaming everyone but himself. But his words no longer pierced me. They were noise, nothing more. As we reached the steps, one reporter called out, "Mrs. Hensley, what comes next for you?" I paused again, looking out at the sea of cameras and microphones. "What comes next is life," I said softly. "A life lived with honesty, with peace, with gratitude. I cannot undo what has been done, but I can choose how to move forward, and I will move forward with dignity." Grace guided me to her car, and as we drove away, the courthouse shrinking in the distance, I pressed Oliver's note in my pocket. His words echoed once more. "Grandma, you're the real key." And now the world had seen it too. That evening, when I returned home, Mrs. Turner was waiting on my porch with a smile. She embraced me tightly, whispering, "Justice has a way of finding those who deserve it." I held her close, tears pricking my eyes, not from sorrow, but from release. Later, as I sat at my kitchen table with the folder of evidence now resting closed, I realized I no longer needed to prove anything. The truth had been spoken aloud, confirmed by the law, witnessed by the world. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift completely. The storm had broken, and in its place was clear sky. It was the morning after the court hearing when the phone rang. I had barely finished my tea, the steam still curling in the air, when Ethan's number lit up the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it ring until it stopped, but something in me needed to hear his voice, to know what desperation sounded like after arrogance had fallen silent. I picked up. His voice burst through the line, raw and unsteady. "How could you do this to me? To your own son? Do you have any idea what you've done? They froze everything. The cars, the house, the accounts. Gone. People are calling me a fraud. I can't show my face anywhere. You've ruined me." I listened quietly, letting him spill his rage. His words tumbled out in broken shouts, laced with the panic of a man who had built his castle on sand and watched it collapse. When he paused to catch his breath, I spoke, my voice calm, deliberate. "No, Ethan, I didn't ruin you. You ruined yourself when you chose greed over family, when you called your mother a freeloader, when you tried to erase the truth written in my hand." There was a long silence. Then his voice cracked, no longer full of anger but tinged with something almost childlike. I thought you'd just stay quiet. I thought you'd forgive me like you always have." I closed my eyes, memories flooding back of all the times I had forgiven him, when he lied about missing homework, when he squandered money I had given him for bills, when he broke promises and left me waiting. I had always let it go, always told myself he was still learning, but he was not a boy anymore. He was a grown man who had chosen betrayal. "Forgiveness is not silence," I said softly, "and silence is not consent. You mistook my patience for weakness, Ethan. That was your mistake." His breathing grew ragged, and then the words spilled out again, faster, more frantic. "Mom, please. You don't understand. Victor's gone. He left me the moment the money was locked up. Clara won't even speak to me. She looks at me like I'm a stranger. I have nothing. Please, help me. You can fix this. You can give me something. Anything." I let his pleas wash over me, my heart heavy but no longer broken. There was sorrow, yes, but also clarity. "Do you remember," I asked, "the nights I skipped dinner so you could eat? Do you remember the cleats I bought when I wore shoes with holes? Do you remember the winters when I wrapped myself in blankets so you could have heat? I gave you everything I had, Ethan, and when fortune finally touched us, you chose to throw me into the rain." He was silent again, and I could hear him swallowing hard on the other end of the line. His voice came back smaller, stripped of pride. "I don't know what to do." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You will live with the choices you've made. That is not my burden anymore. But know this, I have not closed the door entirely on family. I have set aside something, not for you, but for Oliver, a trust fund in his name. He will not pay for your mistakes. He will have the chance to grow with honesty, to build without deceit. That is my final gift to this family." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with disbelief. When he finally spoke, his voice broke. "For Oliver, not for me." "For Oliver," I said firmly, "because he still carries truth in his heart, because he has seen what you could not." His breath hitched, and I thought I heard the faintest sob before he covered it with anger again. "You've chosen him over me." "No," I replied gently. "I chose what was right. You chose what was wrong. Those choices are yours to live with, not mine." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The line crackled softly, carrying the weight of years between us. Finally, I said, "Goodbye, Ethan." And before he could respond, I ended the call. I sat at the table for a long while afterward, the phone resting silent beside me. The ache in my chest was real, but it was no longer the sharp wound of betrayal. It was the steady ache of acceptance, the kind that comes when you realize you cannot rewrite someone else's story, only your own. Later, I walked outside to the porch, the autumn air cool against my face. The trees swayed gently, their leaves falling one by one, and I thought of all I had carried, all I had given, and all I had finally let go. My son had called me in desperation, and I had answered not with bitterness, but with truth. And in that truth, I found my freedom. In the days after Ethan's desperate call, the unraveling of his world came swift and merciless, like dominoes falling one after another. Word spread quickly through town that the Lottery Commission had recognized my claim, and with that recognition, every deal Ethan had boasted about collapsed. The house he had signed papers for was pulled from under him before the first key touched his hand. The dealership repossessed the car he had paraded in front of his friends, leaving him stranded with nothing but debt. I heard much of it through neighbors, through Mrs. Turner, who always seemed to know the rhythm of gossip before it reached the papers. "Contracts voided," she told me one morning, shaking her head as we stood in the yard. "Even the friends who toasted him last week won't take his calls now." Her words carried no malice, only the sober observation of someone who had lived long enough to know that pride rarely survives its own fall. Victor, too, revealed his true nature. For months he had been Ethan's shadow, whispering promises of investments, urging him to cut me out, stoking the fire of arrogance. But the moment the payout froze, Victor vanished. He stopped answering Ethan's calls, leaving him floundering without guidance. Some said they saw Victor driving out of town with a suitcase in his trunk, his laughter loud at the gas station, as if he had won something after all. Ethan was left abandoned by the very man who had convinced him he was invincible. Clara, meanwhile, grew quieter by the day. Once she had stood at Ethan's side, smiling for cameras and nodding at his boasts. Now she walked the streets with her head lowered, her face pale with shame. More than once, she came close to my door, only to turn back at the last moment. I saw her from the window once, standing at the curb with Oliver's hand in hers, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered to him, Oliver looked up at her with the weary eyes of a child who had seen too much, and then he looked toward my house, his gaze steady, as though he knew where safety still lived. Ethan's anger only grew. He shouted at neighbors who no longer returned his greetings. He slammed doors, cursed Clara, even raised his voice at Oliver. I knew this because Mrs. Turner told me she had heard the echoes from across the street, her face heavy with disapproval. "It's all coming apart," she said, her cane tapping against the porch rail. "He's losing everything, and he doesn't even see it's his own doing." I did not rejoice in his suffering, though part of me felt a grim sense of balance. Life has a way of evening debts, and Ethan was learning that truth the hard way. Still, a mother's heart cannot help but ache, even when justice is deserved. I thought of the boy he once was, the boy who laughed in Mr. Cole's shop, the boy who promised to share his winnings with me. That boy was gone, replaced by a man undone by his own greed. One evening, Clara finally came to my door. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling as she clutched Oliver close. "I don't know how much more I can take," she whispered. "He blames everyone but himself. He shouts, he drinks, he talks about leaving town to escape the shame. Margaret, I don't know what to do." I looked at her for a long moment, then at Oliver, who pressed closer to her side. "You do what you must to protect your son," I said quietly. "Oliver deserves better than to be raised in the shadow of anger and lies." Clara's tears fell harder then, and she nodded. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but her eyes begged for understanding. I gave her a small nod, enough to let her know she was seen. She left soon after, but Oliver turned once at the gate and gave me a look that told me he understood more than words could carry. The news soon reached me that the bank had canceled every line of credit Ethan had opened. The restaurants that once welcomed him with champagne now closed their doors. The people who had called him a success story now crossed the street to avoid him. His collapse was not just financial, but social, every layer peeling back until he stood exposed, alone in the emptiness he had created. One night, as I sat on my porch with the autumn wind rustling through the trees, I thought about the way life had shifted. The swing I had once dreamed of was still not built, but the vision of it felt closer now, not because of money, but because of peace. Ethan's downfall was not my triumph, it was his lesson. And while he wrestled with the rubble of his choices, I held steady with the knowledge that truth had protected me. I whispered into the night, as though speaking to the memory of my husband, "It's not vengeance, it's balance," and balance was always bound to come. The leaves rustled in agreement, and I sat quietly until the stars filled the sky. The knock came just after sunset. I had been sitting in the living room with a book open in my lap, though my eyes hadn't touched the page for some time. The sound was heavy, almost desperate, rattling through the quiet house. I rose slowly, already knowing who it was. When I opened the door, the porch light fell across Ethan and Clara standing side by side. Their faces were drawn, shadows under their eyes, the weight of failure heavy on their shoulders. Clara's eyes were red from crying, and she clutched Oliver's small hand as though it were the only anchor left to her. Ethan, on the other hand, looked worn but defiant, his posture stiff, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Mom, please, we have nowhere else to go. Everything's gone. The house, the car, even Victor's disappeared. We don't have money for food. Just, please, let us in." Oliver stood between them, silent. His gaze moved from his father to me, then back again. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. I saw in his eyes the innocence of a child who wanted family, but also the wisdom of someone who already understood too much. Clara's voice cracked as she stepped forward. "Margaret, I know I was wrong. I stood by when I should have spoken. I let him treat you the way he did, and I didn't stop it. I don't expect forgiveness. But please, at least think of Oliver. He needs stability. He needs you." Her tears glistened in the porch light, and I could feel the raw honesty in her words. Ethan's voice rose, a mix of shame and pleading. "We're family. You can't just turn your back on us. I know I said things, terrible things, but I didn't mean it. I was caught up. I thought I had everything, and now I have nothing. Please, Mom, Please don't shut me out." The words hung in the night air, trembling like leaves in the wind. I looked at him, at the son I had raised, at the man who had called me a freeloader and thrown me into the storm. I remembered every sacrifice, every meal skipped, every sleepless night, every hope I had carried for him. I remembered, too, the cold rain dripping down my face as he slammed the door against me. That memory lived inside me like a scar, and it would not be erased by desperation. I turned my gaze to Oliver. His eyes met mine, wide and searching. Without a word, he let go of Clara's hand and ran forward, wrapping his arms tightly around my waist. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I want to stay with you." His small body pressed into mine, and I held him close, feeling the strength of his choice. Clara's sobs grew heavier then. She covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ethan stared at Oliver as if he could not believe what he was seeing. His face crumpled, anger mixing with grief, his pride collapsing in the space of a heartbeat. I stroked Oliver's hair gently, then looked at Clara. "You are welcome to find your way, Clara. You can choose to change. But Ethan," I turned back to him, my voice firm, steady, final. "You chose your path the night you pushed me out. I cannot let you back in. Not now. Not ever. Some doors, once closed, must remain closed." Ethan's lips parted as if to argue, but no sound came. The silence stretched, broken only by Clara's quiet sobs. He looked at me, at Oliver clinging to me, at the door that stood between us. And then, with a shuddering breath, he lowered his head. I tightened my hold on Oliver and stepped back. My hand found the edge of the door, and I met Ethan's eyes one last time. "Goodbye," I said softly. Then I closed the door. The click of the lock echoed in the stillness, a sound both heavy and liberating. On the other side, I heard Clara's muffled cries and Ethan's footsteps retreating into the night. Oliver pressed closer into me, and I kissed the top of his head. Inside, the house was filled with silence once more, but it was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of release, the silence of a door closed not in fear, but in strength. I carried Oliver into the living room, the porch light fading behind us. He looked up at me with tired eyes, and I whispered, "You are safe here. You are always safe here." He nodded and leaned against me, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of family not as burden, but as blessing. That night, as I tucked Oliver into the guest room bed, I lingered by the doorway for a long while, watching his steady breathing, listening to the calm rhythm of sleep. I knew tomorrow would bring questions, challenges, perhaps even more pleading. But I also knew this: the toxic hold Ethan had over me was broken. I had given my goodbye, and there would be no turning back. I returned to my own bed, the house still and quiet around me. As I closed my eyes, I felt no bitterness, only the profound peace of finality. Some storms end not with thunder, but with silence, and in that silence, I finally found rest. The morning after I closed the door on Ethan, the world felt new. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, the kind that stings your cheeks but clears your lungs. I stepped outside with a cup of tea in my hands and looked at the porch that had so long stood empty. For years, I had dreamed of a swing there, a place where I could rest and watch the seasons change. That dream had always been postponed, sacrificed for Ethan's needs, shelved like a book left unread. But now the porch was no longer empty. A carpenter had come the week before, and a sturdy white swing hung there, chains gleaming in the sunlight. I lowered myself onto the seat, feeling the wood smooth beneath me, the steady creak as it shifted with my weight. I let the swing move gently, back and forth, carrying me in its rhythm. For the first time in decades, I felt the small luxury of sitting without guilt, of allowing myself something that was mine alone. The screen door creaked behind me, and Oliver appeared, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his hair tousled. He padded over, still barefoot, and climbed onto the swing beside me. His small frame pressed against mine, and together we moved with the rhythm of the chains. He carried a folded paper in his hand, and without a word, he placed it in my lap. It was the note he had given me before, creased and worn now from being carried too long. The words still glowed on the page. "Grandma, you're the real key." I looked at it for a long time, my throat tightening, and then I placed my arm around him. "You were right, Oliver," I whispered, "and you reminded me of it when I had forgotten." He leaned his head against my arm and sighed, the sound soft and steady. "I just wanted you to know I believed you," he said, "even when they didn't." Tears pricked my eyes, but they were not bitter tears. They were the kind that come when wounds begin to close. "Belief is a powerful thing," I told him. "Sometimes it's the only thing that carries us through." The sun began to rise, casting a golden glow across the yard. Mrs. Turner shuffled by on her morning walk, her cane tapping against the pavement. She lifted her hand in a wave, her smile wide and proud. I waved back, and in her eyes I saw not just neighborly kindness, but recognition. She had seen me through the storm, and now she saw me in the calm that followed. Oliver shifted, looking up at me with curious eyes. "Grandma, what will you do with the money now?" I smiled faintly, sipping my tea. "Money doesn't change who we are, Oliver. It only shows us what we value. I will use it to build something lasting. Part of it will be for you, so you can grow into a man who doesn't have to repeat your father's mistakes. And part of it will go to the community, to the library, to families who struggle the way we once did. Because wealth means nothing if it doesn't help others." He nodded thoughtfully, his young face wise beyond his years. "That sounds right," he said simply. The swing rocked gently beneath us, and I thought about how different the world felt now. For so long, I had lived in the shadow of silence, bearing sacrifice after sacrifice, my worth questioned, my dignity bruised. But now, with the swing beneath me, the child beside me, and the truth standing tall, I felt whole again. Later that morning, Clara appeared at the gate. She did not come inside, but she stood there watching us. Her eyes were swollen from tears, her face pale, but there was a quiet strength in her stance I had not seen before. She gave a small nod, almost a bow, and then turned away. It was not an apology spoken in words, but it was a beginning. I leaned back on the swing, breathing deeply. The note still rested in my lap, its edges frayed, its message eternal. It was more valuable to me than any bank account, more enduring than any title or claim. It reminded me that in the end, it wasn't money that defined us. It was choices. It was love. It was the courage to close some doors and open others. As the wind stirred, carrying the scent of autumn leaves, I whispered to myself, "You've come home, Margaret. Not to a house, but to yourself." The chains creaked softly as the swing carried me forward and back, and Oliver's laughter drifted into the morning air, and in that moment I knew the storm had passed for good.